Welcome to Make Your Mark podcast, where guests share their experiences, insights, and tactics to help you accelerate your business. So building, scaling, and monetizing your business is made easier. And I will be your host, Kay Suthar. Hello, rock stars. And I'm really excited for this episode because we are going to be moving on, right, from this whole podcast journey that we have been on so far. And we're going to be talking about in this episode and the next few episodes regards to launching your podcast and doing it successfully and in the right way. Okay, because there are so many challenges that people are currently having, and I hear them all the time. And so I want to give you all the information that's needed to at least get the foundations of your podcast launch on point. And so today I want to talk about how you know if you're ready to launch a podcast. Now, this is super important. And it's funny because not a lot of people actually are aware as to whether they're ready or not to launch a podcast. And some of them just want to just launch a podcast because everybody else is doing it. And I'm afraid that is not the right reason to launch a podcast. And you're going to find out why in the coming weeks. There is a lot involved, guys. And so you got to be committed. And so there are 3 particular questions I always ask every time I get approached by a potential client that wants to launch a podcast. And so today I'm going to explain what those 3 questions are and why it's really important to make sure that you understand the reason why you want to start a podcast in the first place. And I'm a big believer when it comes to being in the podcasting world, you got to take it step by step and learn. This is how you're going to actually improve and get better in the whole podcasting world, right? As a guest and as a podcaster yourself. But it all comes in time and it's all a learning journey. And so when I am being approached by a potential client that wants to start a podcast, the first question I actually ask them is, well, what type of podcast do you currently listen to? And you'll be surprised by some of the replies that I get back. Most people don't even listen to podcasts, which is pretty shocking in this day and age. But it's true, not a lot of people actually listen to podcasts. And so the challenge there is if you don't listen to podcasts, then you probably don't understand the concept of how a podcast is run, what it's about, the different styles, or really anything about it. And I want you to ask yourself these questions as I go through them one at a time to really self-evaluate and see where you are and see whether you're ready to launch a podcast right now, or are there some steps that you actually need to take first before you actually launch one. So the first question is, what type of podcast do you listen to? Okay, now if you do listen to podcasts, that's fantastic, right? Because the ones that you're listening to is probably the ones that you always listen to, right? You have your particular shows that are your go-to. Now, I know a lot of people have different shows for different things. You might have a podcast where you want to learn business strategies or marketing strategies. You might have one that's just there for entertainment, you know, when you're winding down. And that's okay, because now you're seeing the different styles and the way that different podcasters actually run their show, which is great because you're probably going to be picking up points on, you know, oh, I like this better. I like the way they did that and the way they said this and how they formatted that and the questions that they ask, right? Because when it does come to a time where you want to launch your podcast, all these different podcasts that you've listened to and all the different styles you've been listening to, you're going to have your likes and your dislikes, and guarantee you're going to start thinking all the different styles that you've liked is something that you want to implement in your podcast as well. Now, the second question I always ask is, how many podcasts have you actually been a guest on? Now, if you've listened to the previous episodes, you should know how to do this the right way, okay? And start getting booked on endless amounts of podcasts. And so when someone says to me they haven't been booked on any podcast, they haven't been a guest on any podcast, well, then I'll stop them right there. You're not ready to launch your own podcast unless you start guesting on podcasts. And I always say you need to guest on at least 20 different shows before you launch your own podcast. And the reason for this is because not only will you start building your own confidence as a speaker, but then you'll know what stories to tell, how to tell them. And by being a guest on all these different shows, you'll actually get to know the different systems, the different processes that podcasters use, the different styles, and learn so much more on a deeper level than you would have learned just by listening to podcasts, right? So you want to listen to podcasts. The next level is to start guesting on podcasts. Once you have actually guested on about 20 different podcasts, then you decide that you want to launch your own. Again, you're going to start thinking about what platforms, what processes you're going to want to implement in your podcast, right? How you want to work that, what kind of programs you want to be using, how to make things easier on yourself, automations, all these different things you're going to start learning just by guesting on podcasts, which is why it's super, super important to do at least 20 of these, okay? Once you've done 20, right, or you've done more, and you're finally ready, you say to yourself, okay, I think I want to launch my own podcast now. Because at this point, you're going to see how much work is involved in creating podcasts, okay? And making sure that you have consistent episodes going every single week at least. And I say that at least because you need to have at least one episode released on a consistent basis every single week. And so the third question that I always ask is, why do you want to start a podcast? Okay, now, again, a lot of people come to me and say they want to start a podcast just because everybody else is doing it. So I don't want to be left behind and I need to make sure I have a podcast too. Well, the concern there, the challenge is there is that if you're not doing it for the right reasons, right, and you're just doing it just because everyone else has one, then I can pretty much guarantee that your podcast isn't going to be around for long, okay? That you're going to get a shock of your life when you actually start doing a podcast because you didn't really know what was involved in the whole podcasting process. Podcasting isn't something that you just decide on a whim. It's a long-term commitment, and you got to make sure that you're actually committed to it in the long run, because people do see results, especially if you have the right strategies and the processes in place. And this is something, again, that I teach my clients. But if you're just going to do it because you think that you're going to be making millions of dollars, right, straight away, just because you have a podcast and you see everyone else doing it, no. It's a long-term commitment, and you got to make sure that you're committed to keep going, to staying consistent before you actually start seeing results. And see, I'm someone that's just going to tell you straight. Is the whole reason why I asked them why to begin with. Because if you don't have your reason why, you're not going to continue producing content for your show and releasing episodes. In fact, you're going to go through pod fade. And in another episode, I'm actually going to explain what all of that means. The other reason why it's important to know why you want to start a podcast is because, again, different podcasts for different reasons have their different processes. So, an example, when I first started my podcast, it was for networking reasons, right? It wasn't to get leads or to sell my programs. In fact, when I started my podcast, I didn't really have a program or anything to sell. And so it was just to kind of network, to get out there, to meet different people all over the world and build my network. And for that reason, this is why I did a lot of guest episodes, right? Because this is how you build relationships. And again, you would have heard all about building relationships in a previous episode. And so as I started having guests on show and meeting all these different people from different backgrounds from all over the world, all of a sudden my network grew and grew and grew. Okay. So if it is just for networking, then you want to make sure that you have guests coming on your show every single week. So you're meeting new people all over the world and building those relationships. But if you want to start a podcast because you want to use it as a lead generation, right? So you can actually convert and turn them into sales. Well, then in that case, you want to actually make sure you do solo episodes, right? Not saying that you can't have guests on your show, but you want to make sure that you're not just having guests on your show, that you're actually doing solo episodes and providing content and value and dropping golden nuggets around your niche, around whatever your expertise are in. And it's okay to switch later on down the line. Just because you decide to start a podcast where you want to just do networking doesn't mean later on down the line you can't change it into where you want to actually build it as a lead generator, right? You can totally do that. In fact, that's exactly what I've done. But the only thing that I say is make sure that you know exactly why you want to start a podcast and that you're 100% committed, because basically it is like building a relationship with your podcast, right? You're going to be in it because you got to love what you do. You got to love having a podcast. You got to love being in front of the camera and talking and providing content and making sure that you're consistently actually releasing new episodes every single week. So you got to absolutely love what you're doing, what you're talking about, and keep going. And just to recap, the 3 questions are: what types of podcasts you listen to? Have you guested on at least 20 podcasts yourself? And why you want to start and launch your own podcast. Okay, once you're able to answer those questions, you'll be able to see where the gaps are and what it is that you need to do before you actually decide to launch a podcast, right? So you'll be able to identify some of the gaps in between. You'll be able to understand and see where you're at in the podcasting journey yourself and what your next steps and goals will be. Now, I do have a giveaway for all of you guys who are looking to launch your podcast. And so if you've answered all 3 of those questions and you think, yes, I'm ready to launch a podcast, I do have a really awesome gift for you. And what this does is helps you identify what the foundations are for your podcast. And so you can start implementing this, because the last thing that you want to do is build a podcast, right? And then it just falls flat because it hasn't worked out, because there's gaps that's been left in between. And so this is going to show you all the different steps that you need to take in order to build a solid foundation for your podcast and then build on it. And so all you have to do is go to 14daystolaunch.com, and that's 14daystolaunch.com, and all the links will be in the show notes. So make sure you do scroll down and grab your free gift. And that's it, guys. Thanks for listening to Make Your Mark podcast at www.makeyourmarkpodcast.com. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get this and every other episode that comes out. We have lots of great stuff coming, so make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And thank you in advance for all the reviews and comments. I appreciate it so much. And I look forward to serving you in next week's episode.